For over 50 years, the world has debated who really broke up the Beatles. Was it Yoko Ono? Was it Paul McCartney's need for control? Was it John Lennon's desire to go solo? Everyone had a theory, but nobody asked the one person who saw everything from the inside. Ringo Starr, the quiet Beatle, the peacemaker, the man who sat behind the drums and watched his brothers destroy each other. Ringo stayed silent for decades, protecting his friends and avoiding blame, but the truth haunted him. The secrets he kept, the pain he witnessed, the moment he knew the Beatles were finished. Now at 85 years old, Ringo Starr is finally ready to tell the whole story. Who was really responsible for the breakup? What really happened in those final brutal months? And the heartbreaking truth that nobody wanted to admit. Keep watching, because what Ringo reveals will change everything you thought you knew about the Beatles. Before we dive into video, please subscribe our channel. How Ringo became a Beatle. In August 1962, a 22-year-old drummer named Ringo Starr was playing with a Liverpool band called Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. He was good, but not famous. Meanwhile, the Beatles were on the verge of their first record deal, but their drummer Pete Best was not working out. The producer George Martin wanted someone better, someone with more personality. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison knew exactly who they wanted: Ringo. On August 16, 1962, Paul called Ringo and asked if he wanted to join the Beatles. Ringo said yes immediately. In a 1992 interview with Anthology Documentary, Ringo recalled thinking this was his chance to escape Liverpool and maybe make some real money. He had no idea he was joining the band that would change music history forever, but the transition was not smooth. Pete Best had fans and they were furious about the replacement. At early shows, people shouted Pete is best and Ringo never. In a 2008 interview with Rolling Stone magazine, Ringo admitted those early days were terrifying. He said John, Paul, and George welcomed him, but he felt like an outsider. He was replacing someone. He had to prove himself every single night. Ringo worked hard to fit in. He adapted his drumming style to serve the songs. He did not showboat or demand attention. He was solid, reliable, exactly what the Beatles needed. More importantly, Ringo had a personality that balanced the band. John was sharp and sarcastic. Paul was charming but controlling. George was quiet and spiritual. Ringo was funny and easygoing. He diffused tension with jokes. He kept things light. In a 1964 interview, Paul said Ringo was the glue that held them together. By 1963, the Beatles were the biggest band in Britain. By 1964, they conquered America. Ringo was no longer the replacement. He was a Beatle, but even at the height of Beatlemania, Ringo felt different from the others. John, Paul, and George were songwriters, creative geniuses. Ringo was the drummer. In a 2010 interview, Ringo admitted he sometimes felt like the lucky guy who got to ride along. He said that insecurity never fully went away. The first CRACKS, White Album SESSIONS. By 1968, the Beatles were changing. The trip to India to study meditation had created divisions. John was obsessed with Yoko Ono. Paul was trying to control the band's direction. George was frustrated that his songs were being ignored, and Ringo felt invisible. In a 2015 interview with The Guardian, Ringo said the White Album sessions were the worst experience of his life. The band recorded at different times, separate sessions, barely communicating. Paul would record bass lines without telling Ringo. John would bring Yoko into the studio and she would sit next to him during takes. George would argue with Paul about arrangements. Ringo sat at his drums feeling useless and unwanted. In the 2021 Get Back documentary, Peter Jackson included footage showing the tension. You can see Ringo looking lost and miserable. The breaking point came during the recording of Back in the USSR. Paul wanted the drums played a specific way. He kept criticizing Ringo's playing, telling him to do it again, do it differently, do it better. Ringo snapped. In a 1994 interview, Ringo described walking out of the studio. He told the others he was done. He quit the Beatles. Ringo went home and told his wife Maureen he was finished with the band. He said in a 2019 interview that he felt unappreciated and disrespected. He said if Paul thought he could do better, then Paul should play the drums himself. Ringo booked a vacation to Sardinia and left. For 2 weeks, Ringo was no longer a Beatle. During those 2 weeks, Paul played drums on some tracks. The other Beatles realized they had made a terrible mistake. George Harrison called Ringo in Sardinia and begged him to come back. George said the band needed him. George said he understood how Ringo felt because George felt the same way. In a 2000 interview, Ringo said George's call saved him. George made him feel valued. When Ringo returned to the studio, he found his drum kit covered in flowers, a welcome back gesture from the others. They apologized. They promised to do better. Ringo forgave them, but something had changed. Ringo realized the Beatles were not invincible. The brotherhood was breaking. In a 2013 interview, Ringo said that moment in 1968 was when he first understood the band might not last forever. The GET back sessions, watching it fall apart. In January 1969, the Beatles attempted to get back to their roots. They decided to rehearse and record a new album live with minimal production. The sessions took place at Twickenham Film Studios and later at Apple Studios. They were filmed for a documentary. What those cameras captured was the slow, painful death of the Beatles. Ringo sat at his drums day after day watching Paul and George argue. Paul wanted to control everything: the arrangements, the schedule, the direction of the band. George was sick of being bossed around. In the documentary, you can see George telling Paul, "I will play whatever you want me to play, or I will not play at all." The tension was unbearable. Ringo said in a 2003 interview that he felt like a child watching his parents fight. On January 10, 1969, George Harrison quit the band, just walked out. Ringo described the moment in a 2016 interview. He said George stood up calmly and said, "See you around the clubs," and left. Ringo said his heart sank. First Ringo had quit, now George. The Beatles were falling apart in real time. For several days, the remaining Beatles did not know if George would come back. Ringo called George privately. They talked for hours. George told Ringo he could not take Paul's controlling behavior anymore. George said he felt like a session musician in his own band. Ringo understood. He felt the same way. In a 2018 interview, Ringo said he considered quitting again right then, joining George and leaving Paul and John to figure it out. But George agreed to return under certain conditions. No more rehearsing at Twickenham. They would move to Apple Studios, and they would abandon the live concert idea. Paul reluctantly agreed. The sessions continued, but the damage was done. Ringo said in a 2020 interview that after George quit, the band was never the same. The trust was broken. Adding to the tension was Yoko Ono. She attended every session sitting next to John. In a rare moment of honesty, in a 2014 interview, Ringo admitted that Yoko's presence bothered him. He said it was not personal. Yoko was fine, but she represented John's departure from the group. John was physically present, but mentally he was with Yoko. Ringo said it felt like losing a brother while he was still in the room. The business nightmare, Scandinavianz. By 1969, the Beatles' financial situation was a disaster. Their company Apple Corps was bleeding money. They needed management. John, George, and Ringo wanted to hire Alan Klein, a tough American music manager. Paul wanted his future father-in-law Lee Eastman. The disagreement created a war that destroyed the band. Ringo was caught in the middle. In a 2011 interview with Billboard magazine, Ringo said the business fighting was worse than the creative tensions. He said John became obsessed with Alan Klein. Paul became obsessed with proving Klein was a crook. George just wanted someone to fix the mess. Ringo wanted everyone to get along. In a band meeting in 1969, the vote came down. John, George, and Ringo voted for Alan Klein. Paul voted against. Paul was outvoted 3-1. Ringo said in a 2017 interview that voting against Paul felt like a betrayal, but Ringo believed Klein could help. Ringo said he trusted John's judgment. That trust would come back to haunt him. Paul was furious. He felt betrayed by his bandmates. In a 2012 interview, Ringo admitted that after that vote, Paul pulled away from the group. Paul stopped calling, stopped hanging out. The friendship that once felt unbreakable was crumbling. Ringo said he tried to reach out to Paul, but Paul was cold and distant. Ringo said that hurt more than anything. Meanwhile, Alan Klein took control of the Beatles' business. He renegotiated contracts and found missing money. For a while, it seemed like John, George, and Ringo had made the right choice, but Paul refused to sign with Klein. Paul hired the Eastmans separately. The Beatles now had two competing management teams. Ringo said in a 2015 interview that the situation was insane. He said the band was at war with itself. Paul's lawsuit, the final betrayal. On December 31, 1970, Paul McCartney filed a lawsuit to dissolve the Beatles' legal partnership. The news shocked the world, but it devastated Ringo, John, and George. In a brutally honest 2019 interview with the New York Times, Ringo said reading about Paul's lawsuit felt like being stabbed in the back. He said Paul did not warn them, did not call, just sued them. The lawsuit claimed that Alan Klein was mismanaging the Beatles' money and that the partnership needed to be dissolved to protect everyone's interests. Paul argued he was saving the Beatles from financial ruin, but John, George, and Ringo saw it differently. They saw Paul as a traitor who put his ego above the band. Ringo said in a 2013 interview that Paul's lawsuit killed any hope of the Beatles reuniting. The legal battle dragged on for years. Depositions, court hearings, lawyers arguing over money and contracts. Ringo hated every minute of it. In a 2008 interview, Ringo said the lawsuit turned brothers into enemies. He said John would call Paul terrible names. George refused to speak to Paul at all. Ringo tried to stay neutral, but it was impossible. During the lawsuit, Ringo had to testify. In a 2016 interview, Ringo described sitting in a courtroom answering questions about his best friends. He said it was humiliating and heartbreaking. He said the lawyers tried to make him say negative things about Paul. Ringo refused. He said despite everything, Paul was still his brother. In 1971, the court ruled in Paul's favor. The Beatles' partnership was officially dissolved. Paul had won legally but lost personally. Ringo said in a 2020 interview that the day the ruling came down, he cried. He said the Beatles were really over, not just as a band but as friends. Ringo said he did not speak to Paul for over 2 years after that. The pain was too deep. The blame game. Who really broke up the Beatles? For years after the breakup, everyone pointed fingers. John blamed Paul. Paul blamed John and Yoko. George blamed everyone. And Ringo stayed quiet. In interviews throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Ringo refused to assign blame. He would say vague things like "we all grew apart" or "it was time to move on." But privately, Ringo had opinions, strong ones. In a 2005 interview with Mojo magazine, Ringo made a rare admission. He said Yoko Ono did not break up the Beatles, but she accelerated the breakup. Ringo explained that John was pulling away from the band before Yoko, but Yoko gave John a reason to leave completely. Ringo said John was in love and love makes you irrational. Ringo said he understood, but it still hurt to lose John to Yoko. Ringo also admitted that Paul's controlling behavior was a major problem. In a 2010 interview, Ringo said Paul had great ideas but terrible people skills. Ringo said Paul would push and push until people snapped. Ringo said that is why George quit. That is why Ringo quit. Paul did not know when to back off. But Ringo also said Paul was trying to save the band. Paul saw it falling apart and panicked. His controlling behavior came from fear, not malice. What about George? Ringo said in a 2014 interview that George was the most underrated Beatle. Ringo said George wrote incredible songs like Something and Here Comes the Sun, but John and Paul treated him like a kid brother. They did not take him seriously. Ringo said George had every right to be frustrated. Ringo said if the band had respected George more, they might have stayed together. And what about Ringo himself? Did he contribute to the breakup? In a 2018 interview, Ringo admitted he could have done more. He said he was the peacemaker, but he was not forceful enough. He said maybe if he had stood up to Paul or confronted John, things would have been different. Ringo said he regrets staying quiet. He said silence is not always golden. Sometimes it is cowardly. But ultimately, Ringo believes the breakup was inevitable. In a 2021 interview, Ringo said the Beatles were 4 strong personalities forced together by circumstances. They created magic, but they also created pressure. Ringo said by 1969 they had been together for nearly a decade. They had conquered the world. There was nowhere left to go. Ringo said breaking up was not a failure. It was a natural ending. The reconciliation that almost happened. By the mid-1970s, the legal battles were mostly settled. The anger cooled. The Beatles began speaking again. Ringo was often the bridge. He maintained relationships with all three of his former bandmates. In a 2012 interview, Ringo said he was the only one who could call John, Paul, and George without it being weird. In 1973, Ringo released the album Ringo, which featured all four Beatles as musicians, though never in the same room. John played on one track, Paul on another, George on several. Ringo said in a 2015 interview that making that album gave him hope. He said if they could collaborate even separately, maybe they could reunite someday. There were moments when reunion seemed possible. In 1974, John and Paul jammed together in Los Angeles. Ringo was there. In a 2017 interview, Ringo described the session. He said for a few hours it felt like the old days. They played rock and roll, laughed, had fun. But when someone suggested making it official, John shut down. John said the Beatles were over. Ringo said John's finality crushed any reunion hopes. George was even more resistant. In a 1976 interview, George said he would rather be in jail than reunite the Beatles. Ringo said in a 2019 interview that George's comment hurt. Ringo said being a Beatle was not that bad, but George had his reasons. George wanted to be seen as a solo artist, not just the quiet Beatle. Ringo understood but wished George felt differently. Paul was the most open to a reunion. He dropped hints in interviews. Said he would be willing if the others were, but Ringo knew it would never happen. In a 2020 interview, Ringo said Paul wanted a reunion for the wrong reasons. Paul wanted vindication, wanted to prove the Beatles were his band. Ringo said a reunion had to be about the music, not the ego. Then on December 8, 1980, John Lennon was murdered. The chance for a Beatles reunion died with him. Ringo was in the Bahamas when he heard the news. In a 1992 interview, Ringo said he collapsed, could not breathe, could not process that John was gone. Ringo flew to New York immediately to be with Yoko and Sean. Ringo said losing John was the worst day of his life. George's death and Ringo's grief. After John's death, Ringo grew closer to George. They toured together, played on each other's albums, became best friends in a way they never were during the Beatles. Ringo said in a 2013 interview that George was his brother, his confidant, the person who understood him completely. In 1997, George was diagnosed with cancer. He fought for years. Ringo visited him constantly. In a 2015 interview, Ringo described sitting with George near the end. George was weak but still cracking jokes, still playing ukulele, still being George. Ringo said George faced death with incredible courage and grace. On November 29, 2001, George Harrison died. Ringo was with him. In a heartbreaking 2011 interview, Ringo said George's last words to him were, "Do not be sad." George said he was going to a better place. Ringo said he held George's hand until the end. Ringo said losing George ripped his heart out. With John and George gone, Ringo and Paul were the only Beatles left. The tragedy brought them closer. They started calling each other regularly, hanging out, playing music together. In a 2018 interview, Ringo said losing John and George made him realize how precious Paul was. Ringo said he and Paul wasted years being angry over stupid business disputes. Ringo said he regrets that time lost. AT85 RINGO STARR confirms the final truth. Now in 2024, at 85 years old, Ringo Starr is the last Beatle willing to talk openly about the breakup. Paul avoids the topic, but Ringo at this stage of his life feels a responsibility to tell the truth. In recent interviews, Ringo has made stunning revelations. First, Ringo confirms that all four Beatles were responsible for the breakup. Not just one person, not just Yoko or Paul or the business disputes. Everyone contributed. Ringo said in a 2023 interview with Rolling Stone that John checked out emotionally. Paul became controlling. George became resentful, and Ringo stayed silent when he should have spoken up. Ringo said they all failed each other. Second, Ringo confirms that Paul was right to sue. Ringo admitted in a 2024 interview that Alan Klein turned out to be a disaster. Klein mismanaged money, made bad deals. Eventually, even John and George turned against him. Ringo said Paul saw it coming. Paul tried to warn them, but they did not listen. Ringo said Paul saved their financial futures even though it destroyed their friendship temporarily. Third, Ringo confirms what really broke up the Beatles. It was not Yoko. It was not the business, it was exhaustion. Ringo said in a recent podcast that people do not understand the pressure they were under. From 1963 to 1969, they worked non-stop. Albums, tour, films, press, no privacy, no rest. Ringo said by 1969 they were burned out. They needed a break, but instead of taking a break, they broke up. Fourth, Ringo reveals his biggest regret. He wishes he had fought harder to keep them together. In a 2024 interview, Ringo said he was the drummer, the peacemaker, the guy everyone liked. If anyone could have stopped the breakup, it was him. But Ringo stayed neutral, stayed quiet, let it happen. Ringo said that is his burden to carry. Most importantly, Ringo confirms that the Beatles loved each other. Despite the fights and lawsuits and pain, they were brothers. Ringo said in a recent interview that John, Paul, George, and Ringo shared something nobody else could understand. They went through Beatlemania together, changed the world together, grew up together. That bond never broke. It bent, it cracked, but it never broke. Ringo also reveals what he thinks the Beatles' legacy should be. Not the breakup, not the drama, but the music and the joy they brought to billions of people. Ringo said the Beatles gave the world something beautiful. That is what matters. Ringo said he is proud of what they accomplished, proud of every song, every album, every moment. The breakup does not erase the magic. Where Ringo Starr is now. Today at 85, Ringo Starr still performs. He toured with his all-star band playing Beatles classics and solo hits. He is healthy, happy, surrounded by love. He has been married to actress Barbara Bach since 1981. He is sober, grateful, at peace. Ringo says now that being a Beatle was the greatest gift of his life. He got to make music with geniuses, got to experience things most people only dream of, got to be part of something bigger than himself. Ringo says the breakup was painful but necessary. It allowed each of them to grow as individuals. Ringo also says he talks to John and George, not literally, but in his heart. When he plays their songs, he feels their presence. When he sees old photos, he remembers the laughter. Ringo said in a 2023 interview that John and George are still with him, always will be. When asked what he wants people to know about the Beatles' breakup, Ringo always says the same thing. It was complicated, painful, human. 4 young men who achieved the impossible eventually reached their limit. That does not make them failures, it makes them real. Ringo says the Beatles' story is not a tragedy. It is a triumph. They created, they loved, they survived. That is enough. The final truth. What Ringo Starr confirms at 85 is a truth the world needed to hear from someone who was there for every moment. The Beatles' breakup was not caused by one villain or one mistake. It was caused by the same things that break up any relationship: exhaustion, ego, miscommunication, fear. The miracle is not that the Beatles broke up. The miracle is that they stayed together as long as they did. Ringo says now that he would not change anything. The breakup led to solo careers, to growth, to new music. If the Beatles had stayed together, they might have grown to hate each other. The breakup saved the legend, preserved the magic, let them be friends again. The lesson Ringo wants people to take from the Beatles' story is this: nothing lasts forever. Bands break up, friendships change, people grow apart. That is life. But the love remains, the memories remain, the music remains. Ringo says the Beatles may have ended in 1970, but the Beatles will never die. They live on in every person who hears their songs and feels something. That is the real truth, that is the legacy, and that is beautiful. At 85, Ringo Starr is the keeper of the Beatles' story, the last living witness to the greatest band in history. What he confirms is not scandalous or shocking. It is honest, human, real. The Beatles were 4 imperfect people who created perfection. Then they broke apart because that is what people do. Ringo survived it all, loved them all, forgives them all. And that might be the most beautiful part of the story, not the breakup, but the love that survived it.